My name is Gianna Mercer, and I am 29 years old. I had been working toward my CPA license for 3 years, fitting practice exams into lunch breaks, reviewing tax code on Sunday mornings, giving up every vacation day I had, when my family sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that my support was conditional. Not conditional on my performance. Not on some financial emergency no one had mentioned. Conditional on whether I was willing to help my brother maintain a lie he had been telling his fiancée for 2 years. That Saturday started the way most family dinners did at my parents' house. My mother's chicken piccata, my father at the head of the table with that particular stillness he always wore right before delivering a verdict. My brother Brendan, 32, sat to my left with his arms folded and his jaw set. His fiancée wasn't there. That detail, I would understand only later, had been deliberate. 3 weeks before that night, I had made a comment. That was the whole of it. One unremarkable comment at a work happy hour when a colleague asked what my brother did for a living. I said he was in sales management now, but that he'd had a rough stretch in his mid-20s, let go from a warehouse job after some trouble with the petty cash drawer. I said it the way you say something true and distant, without drama, without weight, because it had happened 5 years ago, and I had assumed it was long behind us all. What I didn't know was that Brendan had told his fiancée he'd spent those same years in a regional management training program. Not let go from a warehouse. Not caught with his hand in the till. A management training program with a relocation and a series of promotions that existed on his LinkedIn profile, but did not exist in the documented record of any company that had actually employed him. What I also didn't know was that a woman from my office, someone I barely knew, a friend of someone who moved in Waverly's circle, had apparently carried some version of what I said at that happy hour back to Waverly's world. Waverly had heard it. She'd said something to Brendan. Brendan had gone to my parents. And my parents, rather than sit their son down and help him tell his fiancée the truth before the wedding venue deposit was fully non-refundable, had decided the problem was me. For 3 weeks before that dinner, I had felt the weather changing. Shorter calls. My mother's texts going from warm to clipped. Brendan disappearing from the family group chat. Nothing I could have named exactly. Just that low, steady pressure that fills a house before someone finally opens a door and says what everyone has been rehearsing. My father set his fork down that Saturday and folded his hands on the table. He said that Waverly was a good woman, and that Brendan deserved to start his marriage without old baggage being dragged into it. He said what I had shared, and he used that word the way a prosecutor uses the word admitted, had created unnecessary doubt in Waverly's mind. He said I owed Brendan an apology, and beyond that, I needed to reach out to Waverly personally to tell her that what I'd described hadn't happened the way I made it sound. That I had been exaggerating. That she could disregard it entirely. He let that sit. Then he said that as long as I was relying on them to co-sign my lease renewal in 6 weeks and cover my CPA review course, the Becker program, $2,400, a birthday gift they had promised me the previous spring. I was representing this family, and representatives of this family did not go around undermining the people in it. I looked at my mother. She was turning her fork over in her hand, eyes on the table. Then she reached over and refilled Brendan's water glass with the same quiet, automatic care she had always given him. Reflexive, almost devotional, and that gesture told me exactly where the math had already been done. I turned back to my father. I thought about the 3 years of practice sets. The lease coming due in 6 weeks, the co-signer I needed because I was switching firms and didn't want a gap in verifiable income on the application. The exam sitting 2 months out, the one I had been building toward since before either of them had agreed to help with the course fees. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about what my father was actually asking. He was asking me to call a woman I barely knew, a woman who was about to legally bind her financial future to my brother's. And tell her a true thing was a lie, not because it would help anyone. Because it would help Brendan walk into his wedding without being held to account for who he actually was. I said 2 words. I said, I won't. Not I won't do that, not I disagree. Just, I won't. Flat. Final. The period at the end of a sentence I had been letting other people write since I was old enough to know better. My father's expression shifted. Not to anger exactly, but to something colder. The look of a man who had run a play he was certain would work and found the other team unmoved. My mother set her fork down. Brendan looked at me, and I held his gaze long enough to be sure he understood I meant it. Then I folded my napkin, placed it on the table next to my plate, and walked to the front door. I sat in my car in their driveway for a few minutes. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, I could still see the outline of my father sitting at the head of the table. I looked at the house, the azalea bushes my mother had planted along the front walk, the basketball hoop Brendan had begged for at 13 and used twice, and I felt something I had not expected. Not grief, not rage. Something quieter than either. I felt clear. I drove home. I did not fall apart. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and opened my laptop. I had a part-time bookkeeping client whose payment had cleared that week. Money I had been setting aside in a separate account I'd started a year and a half ago, quietly, for a rainy season I had always sensed coming without ever naming it directly. I pulled up the balance. Then I pulled up the apartment management office's contact page and made a note to call first thing Monday. Then I searched payment plans for Becker CPA review and spent 2 hours reading through every option I'd never let myself look at when I was still assuming my parents were handling it. There was more available than I had allowed myself to believe. At some point I texted my friend Suki. We'd worked together briefly at my old firm, and she'd had a spare room sitting empty since her former roommate moved to Denver 6 months back. I told her I might need it, short-term while I sorted my lease situation. She replied in under 2 minutes, obviously. Come whenever. Keys under the mat if I'm asleep. I slept that night, not well, but I slept. My phone started going off at 7:40 the next morning. My mother first, then my father. I let both go to voicemail and made coffee. At 8:17, Brendan texted me. 4 words. What did you tell her? I stared at it for a long time. No context, no preamble, no explanation of who her referred to, though of course I knew. Just that compressed, pale panic. What did you tell her? From a man who had sat at that dinner table the night before with his arms folded while my father laid out the terms of my silence and had not said a single word. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. My brother, who had watched my parents threaten my lease and my exam fees over a true story I'd told once, casually at a work event, was texting me before 9 in the morning with the urgency of someone who believed I had detonated something, and I had no idea what it was. I set the phone down. I poured my coffee. I waited. My father called again at 8:52, and this time I answered. His voice was different. The measured authority he always performed at the dinner table, that careful, deliberate quality that made every sentence sound like a ruling, was gone. He sounded like a man who had walked into a familiar room and found the walls in different places. He said, Gianna, what did you say to Waverly? Did you contact her last night? Did you send her something? I told him the truth. I had not called Waverly. I had not texted her, emailed her, or contacted her in any form since the previous Christmas. I had gone home, sat at my kitchen table, and spent the night researching my options. I was fine. I was safe. I would be in touch when I was ready. He went quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. The kind that comes right before something shifts permanently. And then he said he needed to call me back. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in my kitchen with my coffee going cold and my phone face up on the counter. Suki came over that afternoon with Thai takeout and a measured, deliberate lack of questions, and I loved her for that more than I knew how to say. We watched most of a movie. She fell asleep on my couch. I sat there with the TV on low and my phone in my lap, waiting. The callback came at 4:26. It was my mother, and the sound of her voice told me immediately that whatever had happened in that house while I was across town was something she had not been equipped for. She said that after my father got off the phone with me, he had gone to find Brendan. He had told him that I hadn't reached out to Waverly, that whatever Brendan believed I had done, whatever had driven him to text me in a panic before 9 in the morning, had not come from me. She said Brendan had not looked relieved. She said he had looked the way someone looks when they understand that the thing they have been dreading has already arrived. Not from the outside, but from within themselves, and they have simply been waiting for the moment it surfaced. My father, she said, had not smoothed it over. He had not nodded and managed and moved the conversation somewhere safer, the way he usually did when Brendan was in trouble. He had sat across from his son and asked plainly what Brendan had been afraid I would reveal. What did he think I'd sent? What did he think Waverly now knew? And Brendan, alone in a room with a father who was no longer running interference, had not been able to hold the story together. My mother told me what came out in the voice of a woman delivering a verdict she had not wanted to reach. In pieces, haltingly, the way things come out when someone has been pressing them down through pure, sustained effort. She said the petty cash incident was real. My parents had known about it since it happened, 5 years ago. They had quietly covered the associated costs. I never learned the exact amount, to prevent a formal complaint from being filed and to keep Brendan's name clean on paper. He had promised it was a one-time lapse, a bad period in his life, finished. They had chosen to believe him. He had told Waverly none of it. He had instead built a different account of his mid-20s and presented it to her as documented fact. The management training program, the relocation, the promotions. She had built her understanding of who she was marrying on a foundation my family had collectively decided to pour for him and then guard. When the secondhand rumor from my work happy hour had reached Waverly, she hadn't confronted Brendan immediately. She had started checking. Quietly, carefully. Cross-referencing things he had told her, asking small questions in the margins of ordinary conversations. She had found inconsistencies she couldn't explain away. The night of the family dinner after I left, Waverly had come to my parents' house. Not to the dinner itself. She had arrived after, when only the three of them were there, and she had sat down with Brendan and told him she knew something was wrong. She asked him directly to tell her the truth. He had told her the truth, not just the petty cash incident, everything. Including, and this is where my mother's voice broke in a way I had genuinely never heard before, the credit cards. 3 accounts, opened over the previous 8 months. All of them in Waverly's name. She had not applied for any of them and had not known they existed. Brendan had used them to cover the gap between what my parents were contributing to the wedding and what the wedding they had all agreed to plan actually cost. The venue deposit, the caterer, the florist, a honeymoon package to Tuscany that had been half paid and that Waverly believed was a gift from his family. $64,000 in Waverly's name that she had not authorized, had not known about, and was now fully liable for. I sat with my phone pressed to my ear and said nothing for a long time. My mother said she hadn't known. Not about the credit cards. Not about any of it beyond the original incident they had agreed years ago to quietly absorb. I believed her. I also believed that not knowing had required a particular kind of practiced inattention that she had been refining for 32 years. But that was not the moment to say so. I told her I needed time. I said I wasn't coming home. I said I wasn't sure home was the right word for what that place was to me anymore. Not entirely because of Brendan, but because of what had happened at that dinner table. Because my lease had been used as leverage. Because my exam and my career had been made conditional on my silence and my compliance. Even if Brendan's story had been true in every detail, that would have been wrong. And now that it was clear he hadn't been telling the truth about anything material, I needed space to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with people who had been so willing to use my future as a bargaining chip. What I did not say, what I left for my mother to carry on her own. They had known about the petty cash. They had helped cover it. They had, with full awareness, allowed Brendan to present a fabricated version of himself to a woman who was about to sign her name to his financial life, and then they had called me to the dinner table and asked me to help make sure she never found out. My mother said she understood. I think she meant it. The weeks that followed were the kind of hard that doesn't make it into the version people tell later. Not dramatic hard, just the daily, unglamorous work of rebuilding. I called the apartment management office and negotiated a larger upfront deposit in lieu of a cosigner, which I could cover from my savings account with enough left over to breathe. I called Becker directly and set up a 3-installment payment plan for the review course. Manageable, mine, not owed to anyone. I picked up 2 additional bookkeeping clients through a referral from someone at my new firm and moved into Suki's spare room while the lease paperwork processed. I studied harder than I had in years because I had made a quiet, specific promise to myself the morning after I walked out of that house. Not to my parents. Not to Brendan. To the version of me who had sat at a kitchen table at midnight running numbers in a spreadsheet and found, to her own surprise, that the numbers actually worked. That I had been underestimating my own stability for so long I had started to mistake dependence for necessity. I passed my CPA exam 2 months later. The final section score came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in Suki's kitchen eating leftover soup. I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I cried. Not from relief, exactly, but from the particular feeling of proving a thing to yourself that you needed to know was true. Waverly filed a police report. That was the part none of us had fully anticipated. Identity theft and credit fraud, multiple counts. The amounts crossed the threshold for felony charges under our state statutes. The engagement had been called off the morning after Brendan confessed. She had moved back to her parents' house in Raleigh and retained an attorney within 48 hours. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't know what I would say, and I didn't think it was mine to offer. Her grief wasn't something I had the right to tend. What I heard, through a mutual acquaintance who reached out once, she was handling it with the kind of methodical, clear-eyed efficiency that told me she had already begun grieving long before that night. That she was going to be all right, in the way that people who face the truth early and directly tend to eventually be all right. My father called me 5 weeks after the dinner, not to defend what he had asked of me that Saturday night, and not to reframe the years before it. He called to say he had been wrong. He said he had spent too long letting his version of Brendan crowd out what he could see plainly in front of him, and that this had included what he could plainly see in front of him when it came to me. He said he was sorry. He said it simply, not performed, not managed, not the kind of apology that is really a request for something in return. He said it the way a person says something true when they have finally run out of reasons not to. It didn't undo anything, but it was real, and I held it carefully, at a careful distance, and said thank you. Brendan and I haven't spoken. I don't know what that silence will eventually become. I've stopped deciding in advance what forgiveness is supposed to look like, or what schedule it's supposed to follow, or whether it's supposed to follow any schedule at all. There are things that need distance before they can be evaluated clearly, and I am still in that distance, and that is allowed. What I know is that I have my license. I have an apartment I signed on my own, my name, my credit score, my proof of income, not borrowed from anyone. I wake up most mornings now without that background dread I used to carry, the kind that lives below the sternum and doesn't have a name until the day it's gone, and you realize it had been there all along. The morning after I left that house, I had packed a bag with my laptop, my study materials, the folder I kept in my desk drawer with my passport and social security card, and the last 2 years of savings account statements, and one other thing. My grandmother's watch. She had left it to me specifically, which had caused a quiet but notable tension at the time, because my grandmother had always seen something in me she hadn't needed to put into words. The watch sits on my desk now, next to my monitor, next to the framed copy of my score report. I had carried it out of that house at 2 a.m, moving quietly past the bedroom where my parents slept, down the stairs I had learned to navigate without sound before I was 10 years old, and out through the side door into a dark that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like the beginning of something rather than the end. I had expected to feel like I was losing something, walking out that door. I didn't. I felt clear. Terrifyingly, completely, solidly clear. And that clarity, the kind that comes from finally acting in alignment with what you actually know to be true, that is the part of yourself that no one can threaten to take away. Not ever. Not when you understand that you were carrying it with you the whole time. If you've ever sat at a table where the rules only applied to you, where honesty was punished and silence was the price of belonging, then you already know why stories like this one matter. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. New stories every week.